Good evening. Welcome to the Mauthe Center. My name is Robert Klein. I'm program director here. Abby Ledman back there in the corner is our executive director. Jill Olson right here is our assistant director. James Johnson back over here is our director of community engagement. And we have some student staff running around. I see Zakaria here, and Shania is somewhere online. We'll wave to Shania here. Hi, Shania, online, and Carter is back there somewhere as well. So thanks to everybody from the Mauthe Center for making this possible. Also, thanks to our fabulous volunteer right through the window there, Jeremy. Everybody turn and wave at Jeremy. Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Good to have you here. We're really pleased tonight to be hosting the Harvey Kaye State of Democracy series. You're going to hear more about that from others. First, I just want to say a little something about where you are. The Mauthe Center is an independent nonprofit here on the campus of UW Green Bay. We are really pleased to welcome so many of our UW Green Bay friends and community friends here tonight. We, as our purpose, as our mission, try to create community conversation and interfaith connection. We recognize that there are a lot of divisions in this world, and that there are people polarized over all kinds of issues. And we try to create the conversations that start to break down some of those walls and start to cultivate mutual respect. And so we're really glad you came for this. I want to thank also the staff from the Democracy and Justice Studies program. And I want to make one quick note for you who are here as students. If you came because John Shelton or David Curry or anybody else said you would get some credit for being here, there is a barcode, which is where? Back here by the door, that if you scan that QR code, it will register your attendance, which your professors would like. Okay, so that's just an inside one for you students. I also want to acknowledge that there will be a reception right after this event. So don't scurry out the door. Instead, you can go out that door and go by the reception table, grab some food, and come right back in for some continuing conversation. So after we're finished here, the reception will continue in the same space. I'll remind you again when we're finished, but I'm telling you now, if you came hungry, you don't have to leave hungry. All right, that's a good thing. So it's my job to introduce my friend John Shelton. John is the host of the Harvey Kaye State of Democracy series. He is professor and full professor. He's a young guy, but he's full professor and chair of Justice and Democracy Studies here at UW Green Bay. He's the author of The Education Myth, How Human Capital Trumped Social Democracy, and Teacher Strike, Public Education and the Making of a New American Political Order. He's an affiliate faculty member here at the Mauthe Center, and he's the elected president of UWGB United, which is the campus faculty and staff union. He's also served as vice chair of Green Bay's first ever Equal Rights Commission. He's a passionate professor, an influential leader, and a good friend. John Shelton.
It's so great to see everybody here today, and thanks again to the Mauthe for hosting this. This is a really, really good partnership. I wanted to just acknowledge a couple of local elected officials who are here today. So we've got Mayor Eric Genrich right here, and Senator Jamie Wall right over here. I don't think there's anybody else. James, are you in an elected office? No, okay, right. This is part of a speaker series that is really a special thing. So for a very long time, my very dear friend and colleague, Harvey Kaye, who's sitting right up here, along with his wife, Lorna, okay? Harvey ran the speaker series, but with a hell of a lot of help from, sorry, I can't say that in an ecumenical center, I'm sorry. With a heck of a lot of help from Lorna. Their budget, the budget for this series was so tight the people actually stayed at Harvey and Lorna's house. And fortunately, Jamelle did not have to stay at my place last night. My kids would have probably been pretty annoying. But no, seriously, this speaker series really, in many ways, put UW Green Bay on the map. Harvey brought really big names here. Everybody from David Brooks, E.J. Dionne, the very influential historian David Montgomery. And so when Harvey retired, we were all sad that he retired. But thanks to the support of the administration on this campus, we were able to start a speaker series called the Harvey J.K. series. We tried to really honor the spirit of that series by bringing in people from all over the political spectrum and influential people from across the country. This is the 4th year we've been doing this, and this is the talk of the semester, and so we're really excited to be able to do this. So if you would just please help me in honoring the legacy of Harvey and Laura. And as I mentioned before, we're able to fund this series thanks to the generous support of the administration here. And so I'd like to bring up intellectual support as well. But I'd like to bring up Dean Ryan Martin to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the college and the university.
Hey, everybody. I am really, really happy. By the way, I wrote my comments on my phone and I'm already regretting it because I'm getting older, and you know what? It's not always easy to see. So I just want to say thank you all so much for being here. I'm really, really excited for the talk, and I'm going to keep my comments super brief because I too am excited for the talk. I do want to say something really important about why we're here tonight, though. And you know, I spend a lot of time in the college talking about the importance of public scholarship. I want our work, the work of our faculty and staff and students to be accessible, to be viewed by as many people as possible. And that's relevant here tonight because that's the kind of work that Harvey Kaye did throughout his career. A big part of our purpose as a university is to share big transformative ideas with the community, and not just the UW Green Bay community, but with the broader communities we serve. It's what Harvey did throughout his career, and it's what we continue to do in his name through this speaker series. So I share John's enthusiasm for your career and for the value of this series. It's really, really important. So thank you for being here today, everybody. Thank you to the committee for bringing in such an exciting speaker. Thank you to Jamelle for what I'm certain is going to be an extraordinary talk. And thank you, Harvey, for the career that we're honoring today. So. I'm supposed to bring up our next speaker, who is going to introduce the main speaker. So I asked him in advance what he would like me to say. He said, just tell people what a great guy I am. So can confirm he is a great guy. And he is also was Jamelle's roommate for a year in Charlottesville, and he's a physicist here at UW Green Bay. It's Bill Durienzo.
Thank you for those very kind words. I also have my notes on the phone, although I mostly didn't write these, so if there's any inaccuracies, it's not my fault. And if you do like the intro, then ignore that apparently. So tonight we are honored to be able to welcome Jamelle Bouie to UW Green Bay. Jamelle is a distinguished journalist and one of the most important national voices on American politics, particularly on issues of economic security for working people, race and racial inequality, and how historical memory connects to contemporary political divisions. He has written for the American Prospect, The Nation, Slate, and for the past 6 years for the New York Times, where his provocative, regular columns have definitively helped to shape the nation's discourse. Jamelle is also a gamer and regularly streams on Twitch, including, according to Unconfirmed Reports, Chrono Trigger. So you can check him out there as well. I'll also say he's a really good cook and was excellent to my dog, Nicole, when she was still alive. So I took some very nice pictures of her that I really appreciate. So with that, let's give him a very warm welcome. Finally, the person.
I should turn this on. All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here. This is my first time to Green Bay, not to Wisconsin, but it's been a real pleasure to be up here I haven't had a ton of time to explore, although I did have a hamburger at Al's, which I'm told is a thing that people do. Also, and this is funny to me, but I packed my bag on Tuesday just to get it done early. And I'm putting on my clothes this morning and I'm like, okay, I got my green blazer, my yellow striped shirt. And this is entirely unintentional. It just kind of happened. And I brought a yellow baseball cap and I was like, it's too much. I can't have that wearing around because people will be like, why is that guy? I mean, no one will be like that here, but I will be self-conscious about it. So I just thought I'd mention that. I'll just say I'm pandering to y'all. So go Packers. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Constitution, about the notion of a constitutional crisis, and kind of walk through that and talk not so much about what we can do, but what I think the state of things are at the moment and what that sort of means for us all. I wrote about some of this week for the Times. I was telling Bill actually earlier that, and I was simultaneously writing for the page and writing for this talk. Like I wrote this specifically for y'all, but then I also was like, I can kind of turn this into a column too. So it's a little bit of both. We'll say it's adapted for the page, but this is the original version, so to speak. So here we go. All right. I was on PBS NewsHour not long ago, and I was asked whether I thought we were in a constitutional crisis. And I've been asked that a lot over the last month or so. Is this a constitutional crisis? It really is the question of the day. And it's a good one, I think, considering the circumstances of American politics at this moment. Congress, for the most part, has surrendered its power of the purse. The president has sort of claimed the ability to unilaterally cancel or freeze or suspend congressional appropriations. He's done this with the help of, I have no better way to describe him, but like a rich guy who happens to be also in the White House, directing his own subordinates to do this cancellation and freezing of funding. A real violation, I think, of sort of a basic part of our constitutional order, which is that Congress tells the president what to spend and the president spends it. The actual president has asserted a unilateral executive authority that's so powerful and so far-reaching that it kind of threatens separation of powers. He's rejecting, at least in theory, the ability of some courts to bind his behavior. And it's likely the case that if Congress were willing to push back on the president, he'd reject their ability to hold him accountable. If that same president, kind of citing this broad and unilateral executive power, has taken action such as an attempt to unravel birthright citizenship that blatantly and flagrantly violate the plain letter of the Constitution. So those are the points in favor of the constitutional crisis. But critics of the crisis view note correctly, I think, that for all of the president's lawbreaking and transgression and overreach, the president has yet to take the kind of steps that would clearly mark a crisis. Openly defying the lower court order, or more dramatically, just openly defying the Supreme Court altogether. This hasn't happened. The administration has been obeying court orders, although being a little sneaky about it, but obeying court orders. One thing the language of crisis captures, though, is the degree to which the American political system is clearly under a lot of stress. And to the extent that that stress threatens the constitutional order, I think it's because the American system has been in a profound state of disrepair for quite some time. And if we are in or approaching a constitutional crisis, it has very much been a long time coming. So let's rewind the clock somewhat. Back in 2009, the heady days of 2009, when everything seemed much better, I guess. A couple legal scholars published an article in Constitutional Crises titled, aptly enough, Constitutional Crises. And the aim of their argument was to try to distinguish ordinary political conflict, even extraordinary political circumstances, from a constitutional crisis. Their main claim I'm quoting them here, is that when constitutional design functions properly, there is no crisis, even if people disagree with and threaten each other. But on the other hand, if constitutional design begins to break down, either because people abandon it or because it is leading them off of the proverbial cliff, disagreements and threats take on a special urgency that deserves the name crisis. To put this all a little differently, a constitutional crisis occurs when a constitution fails to achieve its primary task, its central task, which is to channel ordinary political disagreement into ordinary politics. When that disagreement begins to break down into violence, when you begin to see anarchy or even civil war, then you can say you have a constitutional crisis. And then the legal scholars, Jack Balkin and Sandy Levinson, they offer a typology of democratic constitutional crises, primarily in the US, although this can extend to other systems as well. You don't have to have a written constitution of constitutional crises as the English discovered in the 17th century. For those of you who want to read about the English Civil War sometime. I would say it's interesting, but I mean, is it really? So here are the types of constitutional crisis they lay out. There's the type 1 crisis in which a political leader has basically claimed the right to suspend the Constitution in order to preserve the overall social order and to meet the exigencies of the moment. In this kind of crisis, a president has basically asserted sovereign power, the power to create a state of exception in the society. And he's acting, in the words of John Locke, without the prescription of the law and sometimes even against it. Now, in the United States, no president has ever really done this. This is not a thing that our presidents have ever tried to do thus far. Instead, those presidents who want to claim some sort of extraordinary power tend to frame their actions as a necessary exercise of legitimate authority. When Abraham Lincoln decides to prosecute the Civil War in 1861 after South Carolina fires on Fort Sumter, he doesn't say, I'm suspending the Constitution. He says, well, listen, I have to do this to preserve the Constitution. Says to Chief Justice Roger Taney, shall I let all the laws but one go unexecuted? And this is in relation to his suspension of habeas corpus. And more recently, after the September 11th attacks, President George W. Bush, in asserting extraordinary authority to engage in renditions and engage in military action, does not say we need to suspend the Constitution. He says, well, this is my inherent authority as commander-in-chief of the United States. In the type 2 crisis, political leaders don't abandon the Constitution as much as they kind of do the reverse. It's a situation where the constitutional order is clearly failing. Some crisis, some emergency is putting extraordinary stress on the entire system. But lawmakers just refuse to break from their constitutional duties. They're like deer in headlight, in the face of an emergency. Balkin and Levinson write, if a type 1 crisis features actors who publicly depart from fidelity to the Constitution, then a type 2 crisis arises from excess fidelity to the Constitution, where political actors adhere to what they perceive to be their constitutional duties, even though the heavens fall. To go back to the 1860s, there's a kind of a great example of this, a paradigmatic example of it, and that is the secession crisis, when James Buchanan, the then president at the end of 1861, kind of sat there and like twiddled his thumbs as Confederate armies raided armories, as members of his own cabinet began giving material support to the Confederacy. And his whole thing was like, nothing I can do, I'm sorry. There's probably some things he could do, I would imagine. But that's a perfect example of a type 2 crisis in American political history. The third and final category of constitutional crisis that Balkin and Levinson discuss involves one where everyone is saying, I'm adhering to the Constitution, but they all disagree about what that means and what that requires and who holds the appropriate amount of power. So what distinguishes this from just ordinary politics is that at some point in this kind of conflict, someone decides, listen, we got to start shooting. We got to start using violence. We got to start doing things outside of ordinary politics to assert our legitimate, what we believe to be our legitimate constitutional claims. And you can see this type of crisis. I mean, the Civil War is like all of these things at once. And so I am tempted to say, well, the American Civil War. But to move away from the 1860s into the 1870s, perhaps, you can see this kind of crisis in the struggles over Reconstruction, where you have a variety of factions and groups of interest in the South, all making constitutional claims, all saying that we have the correct understanding, and then this kind of just breaking down into violence across the region, such that the main perpetrators, former Confederates, end up reestablishing their authority in the region. So, as I kind of alluded to, this was like, it was like a weird argument to make in 2009. There wasn't really talk of constitutional crisis. People might call things a constitutional crisis. People are like, oh, the financial crisis might be a constitutional crisis. But like, no one really thought that. No one really thought the Constitution was under any severe stress. And this was also published like right after Barack Obama took office. In a moment where there is a real sense of optimism about the future, a real sense that things are gonna get better. The mood and circumstances were a little more appropriate, but 8 years later, at the start of the first Trump administration, when Jack Balkin followed up on this exploration of constitutional crises with an article on what he called constitutional rot. Constitutional rot, a very evocative term. Kind of tells you exactly what he is describing. So if a constitutional crisis is something of an acute event, sort of usually precipitated by some kind of shock to the system, or some kind of internal breakdown, then constitutional rot, like it suggests, is like a chronic illness in the constitutional system. It is the degradation of constitutional norms that may operate over a long period of time. Now, I imagine that many folks may be tired of talking about norms at this point in time. I certainly am. I feel like this is the first time I've used the word in public in like 4 years. Lots of talk about norms for a minute there. But the reason people talk about norms all the time is because it's just true that any kind of constitutional democracy, any kind of democratic system does depend on them for their survival. It's not just following the letter of the law that keeps a democracy afloat. A successful democracy rests on well-functioning institutions that structure the ambition of political actors and structure the acquisition of political power. It demands a certain amount of what you could call forbearance from both political leaders and ordinary citizens when it comes to the use of that power. Politics can't be a winner-take-all game. It can't be a struggle in which if you lose, then you've really lost everything. People have to engage in this knowing that today they win, tomorrow they might lose, tomorrow they lost, the next day they might win. Above even that, constitutional democracy requires a broad commitment to the public good, or what we might describe as civic virtue, which was a particular obsession of America's revolutionary generation. This obviously means elected officials. It includes ordinary people who have a responsibility to keep themselves informed and engaged when it comes to political life. And those officials who are entrusted with the public good have an obligation to further the common interest rather than just narrow concerns of themselves or their allies or whoever brought them to the dance. Even in our system, which is explicitly designed to allow ambition, harness ambition, so that the interest of individual people, of individual political actors, is connected with the constitutional rights of the polity, as James Madison put it, depends on a certain amount of selflessness from people engaged in public life. You can't really have a system where no one really cares about behaving the right way. You gotta have at least a little concern for something beyond your immediate narrow self-interest. So constitutional rot is when all of this just begins to deteriorate. It's when government officials reject the public good in favor of the private interests of their supporters and financial backers, when institutions fail to address public problems, when political actors adopt an ethos of winning regardless of what damage it might do to the entire political system, and when politicians reject any and all limits on their use of power and try to insulate themselves from accountability, democratic or otherwise, through abuse of the power that they have. Each of these dynamics eats at the base of constitutional foundation. And like the rot that may afflict an old home, it will undermine the entire structure if left to grow and fester. Now, if we go back to the earlier typology of constitutional crises, then, if I'm as much as I'm unhappy about the present situation, it is a little bit hard to say that we are experiencing a constitutional crisis. For as much as the president has centered his second term on a radical assertion of executive power, he has not yet claimed to be above or beyond the Constitution. His view, in fact, is that he, quote, has an Article 2 or I have the right to do whatever I want as president, which is wrong, of course. That's not the case, but it's still significant, I suppose. I'm being very generous here. It's still significant, I suppose, that he is grounding this in the existing political order. He's pointing to a piece of text in the Constitution to say that he can do this thing. The Constitution also isn't at this moment faltering on the shoals of a political or social or economic crisis. And our political leaders have not yet turned to extra constitutional methods to try to resolve their conflicts. Reasonable people can disagree about whether or not we are experiencing a constitutional crisis, but I think it's extremely difficult to deny that we are experiencing constitutional rot. I think we can all sense it. I think we can all feel it. I think you can see it in the wide and widening gap between what the public wants from its government and what the government is able to deliver. You can see it in the vulgar influence peddling and the outright looting that passes for normal behavior in Washington. You can see it in just the catastrophic weakness of both political parties, whether it was a Republican Party so hollowed out by extremism and enthralled to the ultra-rich that it was easy pickings for a populist demagogue and his backers, or a Democratic Party whose feckless leadership class is more concerned with securing its own personal influence in the halls of the legislature than building any kind of organization that can secure popular majorities to do things for ordinary people. You can see it in the failure of the entire American political class to really deal with the January 6th attack on the Capitol. We had the committee and everything, but this was a system-level threat to constitutional government. The President of the United States tried to overturn the constitutional order to stay in power, and what happened? That guy ran for president again. He ran for president again, and he's currently serving as president, despite a actual written part of the U.S. Constitution specifically designed for this situation. But hey, it was too hard to do anything about it, so we didn't. And then you can see even more of this rot in the fact that the president has made extraordinary claims to seize the power of the purse, and Congress is just sort of like handing it away. Not even a mugger situation, just sort of like he's a passerby. Here, have my purse, have my wallet, do whatever you want with it. The fact that Elon Musk is something like a de facto prime minister acting with the authority of the president, the fact that he can cancel federal programs without a peep from Congress is a sign of constitutional rot. The fact that the majority in Congress would rather beg Musk for a reprieve, beg a guy, not even elected, to not cut programs that they support, rather than just assert the power of their institution, assert the power that they are imbued with by the US Constitution, is a sign of constitutional rot. And the fact that so many of American institutions are treating these executive orders as if they are royal decrees, as if they are papal encyclicals, treating them as if he were sovereign over the entire country, as if he were a king and not a president, that to me is a sign of constitutional rot. Now, constitutional rot can lead to constitutional crisis, very obviously. At the same time, not every house that rots at its foundation falls apart. Some become completely uninhabitable, but still appear to be otherwise from the outside. And I think the same goes for a republic, the same goes for a democracy. We may retain the appearance of constitutional democracy, even as rot corrodes the freedoms and values that give that term its very meaning. We may have already reached that stage. The government has tried to deport one of its critics for doing nothing else but having speech that they disagree with. Now with the House, there's only really one thing to do about rot, and that's just to remove it and replace it with something new. And I think we have to think about when it comes to our political system as well. If our constitutional order is too rotted through to secure our freedom and our equality and our liberty, then it's time to rethink what it is we actually want out of this democracy. Rethink what it is we want out of the American Constitution. And this is assuming, of course, that we can keep it all intact. Now, I wrote this, and then I immediately was reminded of Ben Franklin's famous quip about the Constitutional Convention. It's practically a cliche at this point, but I'm going to remind everyone of it anyway. As the story goes, Franklin is leaving the hall after the Philadelphia Convention. They've signed the Constitution. I assume they smell terrible. And it was hot and they were in there for a long time. They were drinking a bunch too. I assume they, smell crazy in there. But he's leaving and he's approached by Elizabeth Powell, who is a close friend of Washington and close confidant of Washington. And she asked him, have the delegates proposed a monarchy or a republic? And Franklin, of course, says a republic if you can keep it. Some interesting trivia. This anecdote comes by way of James McHenry, who was a delegate from Maryland, who was also close to Washington. He later served as the US's third Secretary of War. And it's recorded in the records of the Federal Convention of 1787, which is one of the first compendiums of that convention. Pre-Madison's notes, kind of one of the main things that people relied on before Madison published his notes. And the stories have remarkable staying power and it'd be decades and centuries since it entered our popular memory. And I think the reason it's had this staying power, the reason why it's a cliche, is that it captures better than almost anything some of the apprehension and uncertainty that really marked the first decade of the Second American Republic. Of course, there's this first one with the Articles. Somewhat, I think, lost to our history and collective memory of the Founding Fathers is the fact that their optimism regarding their capacity to make the world anew was tempered by a profound pessimism born of past precedent and their own experiences as statesmen and politicians. The framers were more than aware of the fragile and short-lived nature of Republican government, as they called it. A quote from Federalist 9, this is Alexander Hamilton: "It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated, and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. If they exhibit occasional calms, these only serve as short-lived contrasts to the furious storms that are to succeed." And accordingly, based off of this awareness of the volatility of republics, their own choices were informed by the examples of the past. They would avoid the pure democracy of Athens in favor of a system of representation. They would blend representation with some of the aristocratic elements of the Roman Republic, and they would create a new office, the presidency, that would tether the executive power to the rule of law. As the product of human failings and human frailties, despotism could not help but lurk around every corner, and the best they could do was design their new government to be as resilient as it could be in the face of ambition and the will to power. But there was no guarantee that it would work. There is a great book by an historian, Dennis C. Rasmussen. It's called Fears of a Setting Sun: The Disillusionment of America's Founders. And it really captures and explains the pessimism of this revolutionary generation. George Washington famously feared that the nation would be pulled apart by faction and partisanship. A quote from Washington: "I have for some time past viewed the political concerns of the United States with an anxious and painful eye," for Washington in the last year of his life. To James McHenry: "They appear to me to be moving by hasty strides to some awful crisis, but in what they result, that Being who sees, foresees, and directs all things alone can tell." Alexander Hamilton, who devoted his life in politics to building a strong national government, feared the political system was just too weak to secure a strong future for the nation. Here is him writing to Rufus King after Jefferson took office: "Truly, my dear sir, the prospects of our country are not brilliant. No army, no navy, no active commerce, as little government as possible." He's decrying Jefferson's sort of kind of anti-status views. John Adams, basically America's greatest curmudgeon, saw a lack of virtue among the people and feared that they would not be able to resist the temptations of a demagogue. There's an Adams quote, writing to his son, John Quincy Adams, in 1817. if there is anything serious in this world, the selfishness of our countrymen is not only serious, but melancholy, foreboding ravages of ambition and avarice, which never were exceeded on this selfish globe. He's also very dramatic. You have seen much of it. I have seen more. God, this guy. The distemper in our nation is so general and certainly incurable. And I'm not going to talk a ton about Jefferson here, but Jefferson also quite presciently was worried that slavery would tear the country apart. Of course, by this point, when he's voicing this, he's even more kind of a recalcitrant supporter of slavery, but that's part of his concerns there. Now, interestingly, the founding father who lived the longest into the 19th century, James Madison, retained a great deal more optimism about the future of the American Republic. A government like ours has so many safety valves, giving vent to overheated passions, he wrote to the Marquis de Lafayette, commenting on the Missouri crisis of 1820-1821. He wrote that it carries within itself, the government, a relief against the infirmities from which the best of human intuitions cannot be exempt. Now, I think to take the pessimism of the founders seriously, to really engage with their fears, is to see the extent to which they weren't all wrong. Washington's warnings about the dangers of factions are these days well taken, especially as we observe in real time the ways that narrow political allegiance and fear of party discipline can supersede a lawmaker's commitment to anything broader than their own immediate partisan self-interest. How might the majority in Congress deal with illegal and unconstitutional and even anti-constitutional actions if they weren't so concerned with winning the next primary or raising money for the next election? We can both recognize that modern democracy is basically impossible to conceive of without the political party as an institution that works to do valuable coordinating and information providing. But we can also give due credit to Washington. You could see even in those early years, the dangers of factional behavior and blind partisanship could pose to even the most well-ordered political system. Adams's warnings about the consequences of a lack of virtue land especially hard in light of what I think is the rampant dishonesty that almost defines American politics these days. It isn't the kind of ordinary fudging of the truth that just attends politics in most places and most times, but kind of the blatant and unapologetic and demagogic lying that degrades public life itself. This is public officials going before the American people and telling them lies, telling them things they know are not true to gain power, and then using that power to pursue their own narrow interests against the public good. And when virtue extends to all of us as ordinary people, and I think we should look to the extent to which too many Americans indulge in the worst forms of conspiratorial thinking, who indulge the worst fantasies about their political opponents, and who believe anything they're told as long as it flatters their prejudices and preconceptions about people on the other side of a political or cultural divide. That too is an absence of civic virtue. It's a failure to treat each other with good faith and goodwill. It's a failure to recognize that we are not engaged in a winner-take-all struggle, but in a collective effort to live as peacefully together as we can. And then Hamilton's fears about the weakness of the federal state were mostly about his disdain for democracy. Listen, I get that people like that musical. I understand. I get it. Very entertaining. But the real life Alexander Hamilton, not a big fan of democracy at all. So that his fears are mostly about that, but we can still, we're bearing witness right now to an aggressive attempt to dismantle the federal bureaucracy, and we might soon learn what it means to have a weak state in a complex and complicated world. Now, against all this pessimism, there stands Madison's optimism. And by disposition, I'm inclined to be with Madison here. I'm not a particularly pessimistic person. This is because many groups of Americans over our history, especially those because of race or religion or ethnicity, have found themselves outside the so-called mainstream. They've faced challenges far worse than anything we have at hand. They've had to survive as second-class citizens under authoritarian rule, where supposed enemy nationals confined to internment camps, or as supposedly dangerous radicals suppressed and surveilled by their own government. This country has not been all that benign towards many of its citizens. But even in the face of that oppression, those Americans and their allies had the capacity to fight for equality, to fight for democracy, to fight to make this country so much more than it is often content on being. So after surveying the many difficulties facing the country, this is a letter Madison's writing at the end of his life in around 1835. He says that he was far from desponding of the great political experiment in the hands of the American people. He had seen and experienced a lifetime's worth of political turmoil. This is a guy who saw the British burn Washington in the War of 1812. He saw the Missouri crisis almost tear the country apart. He saw the nullification crisis just a decade later almost tear the country apart. And through all of this, he was like, listen, it didn't happen. This place is resilient. And he believed, as his time on Earth came to a close, that the strength of the system he helped create would endure. Here's where I part with Madison. I'm not so sure about the strength of that system. I'm a little skeptical. And it should be said that about 25 years after Madison died in 1836, we're back to the 1860s again, that system did collapse. It shattered on the shoals of slavery. He was wrong about the ability of the system that he helped design to endure. But the fact that his system didn't endure, but that we are still here, tells you about the source of my optimism, which is more the American people themselves, the American public themselves. We don't often think about it in these terms, but democracy is very much our birthright. There is no American identity that's separate from democratic participation and democratic life. American democracy is bigger than the Constitution. It exists before the Constitution. It will exist after the Constitution. It is part of who we are. And at our very best, we are jealous of our freedom. We are eager to expand our collective liberty, and we're trying to build a more egalitarian society. From my perspective, we have a would-be despot in the White House who has no particular concern or interest or care about the tradition of American democracy. Doesn't even have any conception of it. Yeah. But even with a rotting constitution on the verge of crisis, this is still a constitutional republic. And the people in this republic are still sovereign, not the president, not the courts, no one else but us. And so the task, I think, before us is to make clear to those in power who pretend otherwise that we are sovereign, and to make use of our sovereignty to do something about a house that may be on the verge of collapse. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. We have two microphones for questions. So I've got one, Abby Ledman has got the other. I'm standing near the front here because I think some of the people up here have a tendency to ask questions quickly, but I'm not sure, they might not. Who would like to go first? Okay, Abby, it looks like your side right over there.
I think, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, first of all, thank you for coming here. I want to talk about earlier, you statements that you believe that we work in a constitutional crisis. And I believe you alluded to the story of the Palestinian student from Columbia. And I was just wondering your thoughts about it not being a constitutional crisis. And for one, you know, a First Amendment right is freedom to speak and protest. We're feeling being infringed upon. You know, the due process clause, really Fifth Amendment, that was infringed upon also the ability to, you know, seek counsel at a speedy trial. That was one of my biggest concerns. And then two, looking at the law firms of political enemies of the president who are being restricted from their security clearances and their inability to properly represent, you know, the person that they are representing.
So I think from the perspective of the administration, and the typology of constitutional crisis is very much kind of from the perspective of like what are the people in power doing. So from the perspective of the administration, this attempt to deport Mauthe Khalil from Colombia, they're saying that they're following the law, right? They're saying that there is the 1958 law passed during the Red Scare to facilitate the Red Scare oppression. They're saying that that law gives them the right to remove a green card from anyone who they deem to be a threat to national security. Rather, the Secretary of State has that right. So they're claiming a legal basis for this. They're not saying we can do it because we can, right? I mean, to some extent they're saying that, but they're also pointing to an actual statute and saying this is what gives us this authority. And although they did try to remove him to a location where they believe they get more favorable treatment from the courts, that didn't work out, and now Khalil will have a hearing in New Jersey. So, like, I'm not about to say that the guy's getting due process like he's entitled to. He is not. But I think this is a distinct sort of thing, right? They are stretching the law, they're testing the boundaries of what they can do, but they are still grounding this in the legal order. And I think that's sort of the key thing. If they had said instead, well, we're doing this because we don't like this guy and we want him out of here and we don't really care what the law says, then I think, yeah, that's a constitutional question. If a court says, no, you have to give this guy representation, and they're like, no, we don't, constitutional crisis. But the grounding in the law, I think, is a distinction. And likewise with the kind of executive bill of attainder they're trying there, with regards to law firms, they're grounding this in some executive authority. They're saying, you know, the executive power gives us the ability to do this. Are they right? Not at all. But in terms of what constitutes a constitutional crisis versus even extreme political conflict, they're still trying to ground it in a claim made about the Constitution, which is, according to the typology, is what matters.
Got another question right here, and I'm going to ask you all to identify yourselves as you ask your questions, and you, I know, James.
Hi, I'm James, a Democracy and Justice Studies students. You talked a lot about constitutional rot earlier, and I'm inclined to agree, but I'm curious if it might be something more like constitutional sandblasting, more intentional. And the reason I say that is, like, I'll say since Citizens United, there's a lot of corporate interest to the point that today, if you're like a traditional Republican and you oppose MAGA, Elon Musk will primary you. I think there's a lot of people that don't feel represented by the system anymore. And when you don't feel represented by the system itself becomes your enemy, which I think you can see in like the number of people that voted for Bernie and then for Trump. So when you hate the system that much that you just want to see it torn down, like how do you bounce back from that? Like what options even are there?
You hate the system so much you want to see it torn down. I mean, you know, someone like me, right, will say, you don't really want to see the system torn down. You want to see it work for you, but you don't really want to live in a world where there isn't any kind of stability. And it's hard to make that case to people. I mean, I think some of the responsibility when it comes to this lies with elected officials, it lies with people who have direct constitutional responsibilities. You mentioned Citizens United. The 2010 ruling that basically sort of made a mockery of the idea that we could keep money out of politics. And in addition to thinking that that's a bad ruling, I would categorize that as an example of constitutional rot, in that the justices who wrote that opinion, who voted for that opinion, seem to just sort of be out to lunch about the practicalities of the society they lived in, and were kind of indifferent to what might happen if they open the door to that kind of money. They weren't taking their responsibilities seriously enough as people with a tremendous amount of power and responsibility, in my view. And what can you do about that? You can work on trying to create through pressure, through all the mechanisms our political system provides us to create a political class that like takes its responsibilities more seriously. But that's really difficult work. Okay. I did it a bunch already. I'm gonna go back to the Civil War period. Because I think it's instructive in a lot of ways. And what's instructive is the actual origins of the Republican Party, which is this anti-slavery party in the early 1850s, a coalition of anti-slavery parties, really. And one of the distinctive things about the Republican Party in this first decade, basically, is that it is not just making a political argument, or we'll have better policies, but they're kind of explicitly making a constitutional argument. the argument of the Republican Party to the public is, listen, your government has been taken over by the slave power. Slaveholders control everything, and they're making a mockery of the Constitution. They're threatening your rights. They're threatening your ability to live your life free of slavery. And so if you elect us, oh yeah, we'll give you land out west and we'll do all these other things. But the main thing we're going to do is reconstruct the Constitution to protect you from the slave power. That was kind of their core appeal to the American public. In that kind of constitutional appeal, no one makes that anymore, right? That doesn't exist in our politics so much anymore. And I would say that to the kinds of people who are so skeptical of the government, skeptical of the system, they want to tear it down. I think that one way to maybe appeal to them is for political party, political movement to speak in these terms again. Speak not just in terms of here are the things I am going to give you, but like I'm going to give you a vision of what I want this country to be and what I think your role in it ought to be, and what I think your not just your rights and obligations ought to be, but what your privileges ought to be, and speak to that. That's the best I can think of. But I'm also not, I've never won an election, so you know.
Hey, Jamelle. Hi, here. Hi, Jesse, reporter with the Green Bay Press Gazette. I would love to debate with you later about, the Lockean arguments that you brought up in your speech, because I personally have a more Hobbesian view. But I want to ask journalist to journalist, kind of, where do you see your role as an opinion columnist in reporting details and then bringing them, forming ideas out of them that you then put in your columns in this whole argument of constitutional law?
I see my role as an opinion columnist. Okay, so a little background about the New York Times. Am I on camera here? I am. I can't say too much. A little background about the New York Times, about the columnists. So in some places, the columnists are basically sort of freelancers, right? They're there, they write, they're on contract. At the Times, we are staff writers. We are on staff. The Times pays our health insurance. The Times is a pension for us, that kind of thing. And in practice, although in theory I could be fired if I were to write something or say something outrageous, in theory, looking at that camera. In practice, it's basically like having tenure. Like I'm there until I don't want to be there anymore. And so for me, one advantage that gives me, one thing I try to do with the platform, to do with the space, is I can spend a lot of time reading, research, speaking to scholars and academics and people who have devoted their lives to the subjects I'm interested in, and try my best to sort of translate their ideas for a general public and try to get my spin on those ideas and try to bring those ideas into the public sphere. And that's sort of what I see my job as being. Like I think Americans should have more open and critical conversations about their Constitution. I think the Constitution worship, the founder worship, all of this is actually quite harmful. And I think it erodes our ability to think of ourselves as people who can engage in acts of creation about the kind of society that we live in. And part of what I consider myself, my role of doing, it's just to sort of encourage that by making these sorts of arguments in the public, by making these sorts of criticisms, by saying, I don't think this works quite well, and here's why. By pointing to other periods in American history where Americans were engaged in acts of creation and saying they're not so different than we are. Even the founding fathers aren't that much different than we are. And so that's what I see my own role. Doing stuff like this, I see as part of that role. I taught a class in the Constitution earlier this year for the winter term at Williams College. That I consider that part of my role. Just sort of like doing that is how I see the role of someone like myself. What I don't see it as is, picking up a pen and saying, well, here's what bothers me this week. Like who cares? Like not even my wife cares about that, right? No one cares about that. But I have the opportunity to educate myself, to learn myself, right? To engage in a continual act of learning. And I feel like the Times has afforded me an opportunity to then just sort of like share that with whoever wants to read it.
Maybe a question of.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Super cool. So my name is Jonathan Lowry. I am in the student teacher program. I currently teach a push course. And my students are quite nervous and apprehensive about the current political situation. So I wanted to ask you, what would you want to say to a group of apprehensive but eager students who are very interested into our current political situation to assist with their apprehension and their anxieties?
It's a great question. I think my immediate inclination, I kind of like did a little bit of this towards the end of the talk, I alluded to it, is to first try to break students of any notion that American history moves in some straight upward path forward, right? Sort of, I think part of what may generate the anxiety and apprehension is the sense, well, everything's supposed to be getting better and now it's getting worse. What's the deal? Is it always going to get worse? And this isn't going to sound particularly hopeful, right? But I think it's useful for students to learn that, like, no, actually things get worse in this country all the time. Actually, things move backwards quite frequently. And that the notion that we're on an upwards trajectory ever and forever is a myth. And that there have been real periods of retrenchment for many Americans. And I would talk about those periods of retrenchment. I know a lot about Jim Crow and the Jim Crow system, but there are other examples. But the thing I would emphasize, right, is that even during those periods of retrenchment, even in circumstances where it seemed like people had no political agency whatsoever, right, in the worst parts of Jim Crow, right, if you're Black, you can't, not only can you not vote, but attempting to vote means risking your life. And yet people still have political agency, right? The civil rights movement didn't just erupt like, you know, like Athena from Zeus's head, right? Like it has its foundations in civil rights struggles in the 20s and 30s, and they have their foundations in struggles at the beginning of the 20th century and in turn in Reconstruction, right? People are always exercising agency. We always have agency. We're not particles floating, pushed aside by the wind, right? We can act, and we can act collectively, most importantly. And I would spend time just reminding students of that fact, and you know, showing, right, that, like, you know, the late John Lewis was a kid in the 1960s. Carter G. Woodson, who is my son's namesake, was a young man when he started getting organized. He started getting involved in serious organizing. W.E.B. Du Bois was barely 30 when he wrote The Souls of Black Folk, right? Like, when you start looking at the people who we look back and say, these people, Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells, you say these people did important things to challenge a system of oppression. They're young. And even if they, you know, they're existing in circumstances far more dire, I think, than we are at this moment. And that fact that they are still exercising agency, even in the midst of that, I think is an important lesson for students to learn, to help frame where they are, right? Like, things are worrisome, things are scary. But first of all, history doesn't end. It doesn't end. I'm about to quote a terrible movie. There's the 1991 Andrew Davis Die Hard on a Boat movie, Under Siege, starring Steven Seagal, has a wonderful performance from Tommy Lee Jones, and he plays a terrorist on the ship. If you've never seen Under Siege, and I'm gonna say don't see it, but if you've never seen it, I mean, I like it, but Tommy Lee Jones, he's like a crazed terrorist. And he says something like, you know why they call it a revolution? Because it just keeps on rolling. And he plays like a blues rocker. So, but that's true of history, not just revolutions. It's just true of history. It doesn't stop moving. And so, you know, I think reminding students of their agency, of the fact that things have gone backwards before, and people have, through their agency, tried to push them forward, and reminding them that, like, things don't end. And, you know, history is contingent. that your actions actually do matter. I think that as well. That would be my reaction. That's what makes me feel better, so.
Thank you.
We do have a number of people watching by way of Zoom webinar, and they also are able to ask questions. So I'm going to relay one of those questions now. And this one also speaks a bit about agency and what we can do. To quote, what happened to checks and balances? As we watch presidential actions precipitate the tanking of the stock market, what feature of our democracy will protect this economically vulnerable public?
So I'm gonna look straight into the camera, so do the John Kerry thing. I'm like in my late 30s now, and so all my political references and media ones are from like 20 years ago. Which I guess works for most of you, but for the younger folks, it may not. John Kerry used to do this a lot, and I always thought it was funny. We can do a Bill Clinton thing. So the thing about checks and balances, right, is that they're ultimately just words on paper, and they depend on people in office being willing to exercise the power that they have. Some of those people are doing them. The courts are, taking seriously their duty to kind of uphold the law. But the actual actor who's supposed to be doing the most right now, who can act the fastest, is Congress, and the majority in Congress, for reasons of partisan affiliation, for reasons of fear, perhaps, just isn't doing anything and choosing not to lift their finger. And even the minority in Congress is really struggling to figure out a way to be in opposition. So at the moment, in a real way, formal checks and balances may not exist at this moment. When you have a president asserting, unilateral executive authority, mostly supine legislature, the courts move slowly at their own speed. There's not a lot you can do there. But the public, the people, they are themselves a kind of institution, right? Kind of to borrow the language of the French Revolution, we were in a state in the society. We're the third estate, as it were. And public pressure, public discontent, public anger can still shape the behavior of lawmakers. You do see it with the president and his real worries about the stock market. He keeps kind of pushing these tariffs, then backing off. And that's as much a reaction to what he thinks will happen to his public standing if there is a stock market crash or another one, as it is anything else. You're seeing it with the fact that I guess the Tesla protests that are happening is having at least enough of an impact. They had like a used car sale at the White House for Teslas. So I think we're at a stage where it's sort of public opinion is going to be the thing that matters most. Like public action is going to be the thing that matters most. And there will be, midterm elections. I mean, kind of the thing about the US is that it is just extremely decentralized, right? Like this isn't Hungary. As much as people like to make comparisons to Hungary, to Russia, to other countries that have gone down the path of authoritarianism, two things really do distinguish us. First is that we have this long and deep-rooted tradition of democracy that other countries have not. And second, we're not a country where everything's centralized from a single city or a single region. This is a highly decentralized place. So there's going to be elections. And there's a very good chance those elections end in a major repudiation of the administration, at which point I think part of the political task over the next, 18 months or so is actually cultivating the will to aggressively respond if you do get power again, to take seriously constitutional obligations, and to recognize that sometimes this is going to be from a more high-minded reference than Under Siege. This is from the 1960 movie The Leopard. Sometimes for things to stay the same, they have to change. For us to stay what we are, a constitutional democracy, I think we're going to have to engage in some serious and radical changes.
Hi, my name is Dan Kiernan. I'm a citizen activist. I always like to come back to what we can do, and particularly align with Jim Wallace's metaphor of creating the wind that will get politicians, attention as they lift their finger, engage the popular opinion. Particularly from your point of view, just what we can do politically, but also, I mean, the press seems so curtailed right now, but also because of, internet, downfall of the local press. What can we do specifically as citizens to support good politics and to support good viewpoints and healthy viewpoints? And I'll pander a little bit here, besides go out and buy a New York Times subscription.
I mean, I would, so occasionally people are like, oh, I'm sorry, Jamelle, I'm serving New York Times. I don't know, I don't care. I don't run the paper, I just work there. What can you do specifically? I mean, in terms of like, so to go back to the public opinion point, in terms of like politicians, I think, yeah, showing, vocal and public support for politicians you think are doing the right thing here, right? Sort of like, calling their offices and saying like, I think you're doing the right thing, keep on doing it. Kind of showing that kind of real support does help. I think in terms of like pressuring maybe politicians who aren't quite doing what you want them to do. It is taking advantage of the fact that like public pressure really does work, right? Like not just phone calls and letters, but like showing up and sort of like kind of saying, you're my representative. Like I demand that you listen to me here, and doing that consistently and in numbers really does make a difference. Psychologically, people react more to dramatic examples of small numbers than like, actual public opinion surveys, right? Like you can tell someone 40–50% of people want you to do this, but if you're never really seeing it, it's just an abstraction. But if like 30 people are showing up in front of your office every other day and screaming at you, then you begin to be like, okay, maybe this is something here. But I'll say some of this is just so. There are going to be people who are not going to budge, and you should just try to remove them from office. Like keep them in elections. Money is important. Money is a powerful force in elections, but at the end of the day, money doesn't actually win elections. Like votes win elections, and it's possible to take down people with money if you just have more votes, if you have more people with you. And then the other thing is, this isn't like a term that I think is in common parlance in American culture, but like it's important to engage in political education, right? Like talking with your friends and neighbors about what is happening and not being embarrassed about it. Just saying, hey, this is a crazy thing that's happening. What do you think about it? Not in a judgmental way, but just sort of like having actual conversations about the things happening in the world. So much of, I think, if we go further down a bad path, I think it will be facilitated by the fact that we have this taboo about talking about politics in everyday life. But we shouldn't. This is a political society. I mean, this is the country we live in. We got to talk about these things with each other and try to persuade each other and try to find like-minded people. And this kind of gets to the media point. I think that the people who can play the biggest role in supporting the press, not even particular institutions, but trying to rebuild a vibrant press, are people with the money to spare to fund nonprofits, to fund new ventures, that kind of thing. In the meantime, I personally, in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live, we have a local paper, we have a local nonprofit. I try to support both of them as much as I can. I try to, publicize and support other journalists. I know doing independent work, but I think it's recognizing. Part of this is going to be recognizing that journalism is a skill, and it requires money, and that because you're going to have to find ways to support the people doing these things with like actual resources. But this is the thing where I think this isn't a conversation about the future of the media, but in my view, what do you do when the market cannot provide a service? And there's a market failure, the public sector steps in. And in my personal view, I think that we're due a conversation about how can we have actual public support for local journalism, for some kind of free press. In a lot of places in the country where there isn't anyone providing kind of basic information about the community, which isn't just bad for not knowing, but it's deleterious to forming community itself, right? Like part of what the press does is help us identify other people like ourselves who share our concerns. And if there's no press to do that, it just makes us all the more atomized and unable to participate in a deep way. And incidentally, there is a direct correlation between decline of local media and like just literal voter participation. The fewer, the less local media, reliable local media there is, the less likely people are to just engage at all with politics. That's like a bigger problem and a bigger conversation.
So we're gonna have one more question, but just before I get to that, piggyback on what you just said, if you want to talk to somebody about supporting a local nonprofit, I'm right here. If you want to talk to a local journalist, Jesse Lynn's right there. If you want to besiege your elected representatives, Mayor Gingrich is right there, and Jamie Wall is right there. Okay, so all right, just say, okay. All right.
Can I just say real quick, I've done a lot of talks. I've never had local public officials come to them, and I think it's really cool. So thank you.
There's another nonprofit journalist right in the front row. Okay, second here.
Hi there, my name is Sakiti. I'm one of the student coordinators here. My question is, why do you think Democrat representatives are treated so differently than Republican representatives? Trump is able to threaten our allies, have say nothing about our enemies, our trading wars with them, but yet his side still supports them. Well, I think that Democrats can never get it right. They're constantly criticized. It seems like an unfair playing field.
Yeah. So I think some of this is we're like all habituated to the behavior of the president, right? Like I don't like blink when my 3-year-old throws a tantrum, right? It's a thing that happens. She doesn't really throw tantrums anymore. Sometimes she does, and you're just like, yeah, this is what you do, and I'm not going to get upset about it. And I think there's a certain element of that, even when the words of the president are like deadly serious, right? Like there's Dwight Eisenhower had a reputation for being like not particularly articulate in news conferences, and you're like, well, he might be a dummy. But no, he wasn't dumb. It's Dwight Eisenhower. Is that he was so self-conscious about the weight of the words of the president that he just like found it difficult to just be clear when he's speaking off the cuff. And many presidents have said something similar, just sort of like our words matter a lot. So even though the words of the president matter a great deal, we happen to have this president who treats his words loosely, and in a funny way, we've all got habituated to that, even when it still matters, right? Like I'm going to throw 200% tariffs on wine, and like the markets crash because it's the president of the United States threatening to place 200% tariffs on imports totaling $10 billion. Like, yeah, it's kind of a big deal. On the flip side, and this is kind of perverse, I think the extent to which Democrats have made we're the responsible ones, their political identity does result in more people being like a way harsher. Like, well, yeah, you guys are supposed to be the grown-ups, so like behave like grown-ups, do grown-up things. And when they're not behaving in a way that people view to be responsible, then I think they get more criticism. Now, my own view is that like I don't think Democrats should make being the responsible ones their identity. I think that especially the press should not just treat Trump's words like they are, just what I can't think of a word. Like what I'm trying to say. I think we should, and this is always been my perspective. You gotta take what people say seriously, even if they themselves don't take it seriously. And in the case of Democrats, I think they need to learn what the purpose of the political party is. Again, it's not to be you know, Mr. Responsible, it's to stand up for the people you represent and pursue a program. And that's, getting them to do that, is probably gonna be as difficult as getting the president to take his word seriously.
Jamelle Bouie, thank you very much.